A woman's prejudice leads her to insult a black soldier on a plane, but the news the next day reveals the heartbreaking truth, leaving her to confront the weight of her actions. The waiting area at Chicago O'Hare International Airport buzzed with restless energy on a wet, blustery November morning. Overhead, piercing announcements sliced through the low hum of conversation, reminding passengers to check their gates, watch their belongings, and stay alert for last-minute schedule changes. Beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, a diverse crowd mingled, families with strollers, business-suited professionals, and backpack-toting students, all converging at Gate A17. The flight to Atlanta, originally scheduled for 9 a.m., had been delayed, sparking groans of frustration among many. At the center of a cluster of first-class passengers stood Julia Prescott, a polished corporate executive in her early 30s. Her tailored gray blazer and pencil skirt spoke volumes about her professional success. A silver barrette pinned back her blonde hair with precision, and her black pumps tapped impatiently on the linoleum floor. Julia's green eyes betrayed her annoyance, the irritation of someone accustomed to snapping her fingers and seeing results. She was en route to an important management conference, one she planned to dominate with charm, wit, and a flawless presentation. Her phone buzzed incessantly with urgent emails, each demanding her expertise and rapid response. She scrolled through them with an air of practiced efficiency, trying to suppress her growing impatience. When the crackling overhead speaker finally announced boarding for first-class passengers, Julia exhaled sharply, clutching her designer handbag and glossy tote stuffed with a laptop and files. Relief washed over her as she strode briskly down the jet bridge, eager to escape the chaos. Inside the plane, the first-class cabin offered a stark contrast to the tumultuous terminal, a cocoon of luxury with extra-wide seats and attendants offering pre-departure drinks. Julia claimed seat 2A, expertly stowing her bag in the overhead compartment before settling in. She made a point of checking her phone again, her fingers deftly scrolling through emails labeled urgent. Moments later, a tall, broad-shouldered black man in a crisp army uniform entered the cabin. His name patch read, D. Parker. He paused near Julia, scanning the row numbers before nodding politely in her direction and pointing to the seat beside her, 2B. Julia's eyes flicked over him, her polished smile masking a flicker of annoyance. Probably some courtesy upgrade or discount, she thought, a whisper of prejudice seeping into her internal narrative. I paid top dollar for my seat. Suppressing her irritation, she offered a stiff nod before turning her attention back to her phone, her body language screaming disinterest. Daniel Parker, unbothered by Julia's cold demeanor, placed a small duffel in the overhead bin and eased into his seat. He nodded at Julia again, but she turned pointedly toward the window, pretending not to notice. A flight attendant approached with a tray of beverages, her cheerful voice breaking the tension. Would you like sparkling water, orange juice, or perhaps a mimosa? She asked. When she reached Daniel, her tone softened. Thank you for your service, Sergeant. Please let me know if you need anything at all. Julia's grip tightened around her phone as she forced a polite smile. Inside, bitterness swirled. Here we go. Special treatment for the military. She shifted in her seat, trying to mask her frustration. Julia had always prided herself on being colorblind. Yet in moments like these, an unacknowledged resentment bubbled to the surface. She despised how public displays of gratitude for people like Daniel seemed to overshadow her own hard-earned success. As the plane taxied away from the gate, Julia noticed Daniel discreetly pull a small photograph from his jacket. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the image of a smiling girl, no older than 8 or 9, wearing a sparkly headband and clutching a soccer ball. Her curiosity battled with irritation until she blurted out, "Cute kid. Your daughter?" Daniel turned toward her, surprise flickering across his features. "Yes, ma'am. That's my daughter, Kayla." Julia nearly rolled her eyes at the ma'am. "Huh," she said, her tone dripping with feigned politeness. She must be proud her dad's in uniform. You traveling home from duty, or something? I'm heading to Atlanta to see her, Daniel replied simply. Something in his calm demeanor grated on Julia. Her impatience got the better of her. Must be nice to have the airline upgrade you, she said pointedly. You're in first class, right? Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained composed. I paid for this seat myself. I'm not looking for handouts, if that's what you're suggesting. Julia bristled, feeling the sting of his response. Forcing a smile, she tucked an earbud into her ear, signaling the conversation was over. But her thoughts churned as the plane climbed through the clouds, the tension between them palpable. Julia couldn't entirely shake the growing unease gnawing at her. Her eyes flicked once more to the photograph of Kayla, her smile so radiant it seemed to light up the tiny image. For the briefest moment, something akin to guilt stirred in Julia's chest, but she squashed it down. I'm just being realistic, she reassured herself. Not everyone in a uniform is a saint. When the plane finally touched down at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, a collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin. Flight attendants cheerfully announced the arrival gate and a rainy forecast. Julia unbuckled her seatbelt with practiced efficiency, eager to put as much distance as possible between herself and the soldier she had dismissed so brusquely. She avoided Daniel's gaze as she maneuvered into the aisle, her designer tote slung over her shoulder. As she stepped off the plane, snippets of Daniel's voice carried toward her from behind. Yes, Miss Carter, I'm here. I'll be at the hospital soon. His tone was calm but edged with urgency, the kind of tone that stayed with you. Julia's pace quickened, the words tugging at her consciousness like a loose thread she refused to pull. I have a conference to crush, she reminded herself, checking her watch and smoothing her blazer. Inside the terminal, she strode purposefully toward baggage claim, ignoring the noisy reunions of families, hurried executives, and starry-eyed tourists snapping selfies under the sprawling airport signs. Her phone buzzed in her hand. A text from a colleague. We need your updated slides by tonight. Big pitch tomorrow. Where are you? Julia's fingers flew across the keyboard, her response brisk and professional. As she hit send, she glanced over her shoulder, irrationally checking to ensure she wasn't being followed by any well-meaning soldiers. Ridiculous, she thought, shaking her head. At baggage claim, Julia's sleek silver suitcase slid onto the carousel. She reached for it, the motion as efficient and polished as the rest of her demeanor. Just as she turned to leave, her eyes caught Daniel on the far side of the room. He was still on a call, his head lowered, shoulders tense. Something about the way he stood, grounded yet heavy, as if carrying an invisible weight, stirred an unwelcome pang in Julia's chest. She quickly turned away, her resolve hardening. He's not my responsibility, she reminded herself. By the time Julia slid into the back seat of her pre-booked car service, rain was pelting the windshield, turning the city's chaos into a blurry smear. The Harborwood Hotel, please, she instructed the driver, her voice crisp. The man nodded and merged into Atlanta's infamous traffic. Julia leaned her head back, trying to focus on the pitch that awaited her in less than 24 hours. Her fingers danced over her phone, tweaking financial figures and fine-tuning storyline arcs in her slides. But no matter how hard she tried, concentration eluded her. A persistent voice whispered in the back of her mind, replaying fragments of her interaction with Daniel. The flicker of pain in his eyes, the quiet strength in his tone, and the mention of his daughter's medical issue. Soldiers come home with sob stories all the time, she told herself firmly. Life is tough for everyone. Get over it. The next morning, the conference was in full swing at a gleaming downtown skyscraper. The event hall buzzed with energy, a symphony of business chatter, cutting-edge strategies, and whispers of potential corporate mergers. Julia thrived in this environment, circulating with confidence, shaking hands, and exchanging business cards. As she set up her laptop for her presentation, the adrenaline of corporate success coursed through her. This was her world, polished, calculated, and entirely within her control. Her pitch was everything she had planned. Sharp slides, compelling statistics, and just enough humor to keep the audience engaged. When it ended, the applause was a validation of her prowess. But even as colleagues offered congratulatory nods, Julia's thoughts strayed. Her phone chimed, and she stepped into a quiet corridor to check her messages. Among them was a notification from a local Atlanta news app. Local Army sergeant's child fighting for her life. Community rallies for support. Julia hesitated before opening it. The thumbnail featured a hospital room, sterile and somber. Against her better judgment, she clicked. The article began. Sergeant Daniel Parker, recently returned from a tour overseas, is appealing for help with his daughter Kayla, who has been diagnosed with a life-threatening congenital heart defect. Julia's stomach tightened as she scrolled. The accompanying image was a punch to the gut. Kayla, the same bright-eyed girl from Daniel's photo, now lay in a hospital bed surrounded by machines, her small frame tangled in tubes and wires. The caption read, Kayla Parker, age 9, awaits a specialized surgery not fully covered by standard military insurance. Words like experimental procedure and insurance gaps jumped out, each one chipping away at the carefully constructed walls around Julia's conscience. For the first time in a long while, Julia found herself frozen, unsure of what to feel or do. Julia found herself unable to stop reading. The article reported that Daniel Parker had returned to the U.S. on emergency leave because Kayla's condition had deteriorated. She required advanced medical interventions at an Atlanta Children's Hospital, a procedure so costly that Daniel had started a modest online fundraiser to make up the shortfall. Julia's heartbeat thundered in her chest as her mind flashed back to the flight. The sneering remarks she'd made, her assumptions, her accusations that Daniel was angling for special treatment, it all came rushing back with a clarity that made her wince. Shame surged through her like a tidal wave, threatening to upend the carefully guarded walls of her composure. She pictured Kayla's face again, bright, innocent, full of life, and the haunting image of her small body tangled in tubes and machines. The lines of worry etched into Daniel's face surfaced in her memory, and Julia realized with a jolt. He wasn't faking anything. Swallowing against the lump rising in her throat, she locked her phone and tried to dismiss the whole situation as irrelevant to her life. Just another sob story, she told herself. But the image of Kayla refused to fade, clinging to her thoughts like a persistent shadow. For the first time in a very long while, Julia felt a tremor of remorse creeping into her heart. That evening, the conference's cocktail hour was in full swing. Attendees clinked champagne flutes, swapped gossip, and exchanged stories about career victories and aspirations. Julia, dressed in a sleek black dress, wore her trademark smile as she stood in a small circle of executives. She nodded at the right moments, laughed when appropriate, and even managed to sprinkle in a few sharp insights about market trends. But inside, unease gnawed at her. Every attempt to engage in conversation about profit margins or Q4 projections felt hollow. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the news article. Kayla's innocent, hopeful face intruded on every corner of her mind. Julia sipped her drink, forcing a laugh at someone's joke, but the guilt loomed over her like a storm cloud. Eventually, she slipped away to a quiet corner near a floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked Atlanta's dazzling skyline. Normally, the city lights filled her with inspiration, a reminder of her achievements and ambitions. Tonight, they were nothing more than a blur. She pulled out her phone and reopened the article. Her eyes landed on the link to Daniel's fundraising page. With a tap, she was staring at the modest goal, $150,000. The current amount raised was a mere $37,000. Julia scrolled down to see heartfelt updates from Daniel and messages from donors who had given what they could, $10, $20, sometimes $100. Each comment expressed prayers and well wishes for Kayla's recovery. Her chest tightened. Julia wasn't strapped for cash. Her salary and investments afforded her a lifestyle of ease and luxury. But giving large sums of money to strangers wasn't something she ever considered. She had been raised to believe that everyone should work hard for what they had, just as she had. Yet reading Daniel's updates, detailing the financial strain of Kayla's experimental surgery and the insurance gaps that left them stranded, painted the situation in a stark, undeniable light. Julia hesitated, her fingers hovering over the donation field. Am I really about to do this? She thought, her mind racing. Parting with such a significant amount felt daunting, but the memory of her cutting remarks on the plane burned in her mind. Slowly, she typed in $10,000. Her heart pounded as she hovered over the submit button. With a deep breath, she clicked. A confirmation message popped up, thanking her for her generous donation. She stared at the screen. Her name, Julia Prescott, bold and unmistakable on the donor list. A thought struck her like lightning. What if Daniel sees my name? Would he remember her as the woman who had been so dismissive, so cruel? She almost wished she had selected the option to remain anonymous, but in her haste, she hadn't. Julia set her phone aside and pressed her fingertips to her temples. The donation, while significant, felt like little more than a superficial bandage over a much deeper wound. I owe them more than money, she whispered to herself. I owe them an apology. The next morning, Julia woke before dawn after a restless night of sleep. Her thoughts swirled in an endless loop, replaying every moment of her interaction with Daniel. She left a note for her conference team, stating she'd be unavailable for a few hours due to personal matters. Then, guided by the address from the fundraiser page, she drove a rented sedan to Peachtree Children's Hospital. The sprawling campus was painted with murals of cheerful cartoon animals and dotted with bright directional signs. But the cheerful imagery did little to soothe her nerves. The scent of antiseptic hit her as she walked through the automatic doors, and the soft beeping of monitors filled the air. Nurses and scrubs bustled about, some exchanging weary smiles as they passed. Julia approached the central desk, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "I'm looking for Kayla Parker," she said, the words feeling foreign and awkward in her mouth. The nurse behind the desk glanced at an electronic tablet. "Are you family?" Julia flushed. "No, I'm a friend, I guess." The response sounded hollow, even to her. The nurse frowned, but after a moment, she nodded and picked up the phone. After confirming with Daniel that Julia could visit, she gestured down a hallway lined with childlike murals. Julia's heels clicked softly against the floor as she made her way to room 312, her palms damp with sweat. Through the glass window, Julia saw Daniel standing beside a small, metal-framed hospital bed. He leaned over Kayla's frail, sleeping form, his broad shoulders hunched protectively. Monitors beeped softly around her, their glow casting a faint light over the room. Kayla was surrounded by 4 lines and wires, her small body swallowed by the machinery meant to save her life. Julia froze, her breath catching as an overwhelming wave of guilt and empathy washed over her. For the first time, Julia felt the weight of what it meant to truly see someone, not just as a passing figure, but as a human being carrying a world of struggles she could barely comprehend. Daniel's back was rigid, his broad shoulders bowed as if carrying the weight of the world. Summoning her courage, Julia knocked softly on the doorframe. Daniel turned, his eyes widening in surprise. "Miss Prescott," he said, his voice a mix of confusion and caution. "Didn't expect to see you here." Heart pounding, Julia stepped inside. The room was small, with stuffed animals lining a countertop, and 4 stands steadily pumping medication, and a monitor emitting soft, rhythmic beeps. Kayla lay motionless, her chest rising and falling faintly beneath a hospital blanket. An oxygen tube was taped just below her nose, her face pale and still. "I read about Kayla's situation in the news," Julia managed, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry if this is intrusive, but I wanted to check on her. And on you." Daniel's gaze flicked over her, his expression guarded. He didn't speak immediately, but Julia sensed the sadness behind his caution. He reached down to stroke Kayla's hand gently. "She's in critical condition," he said quietly. "The doctors say the specialized surgery is her best shot." Julia approached the bedside, her hands twisting nervously. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her throat tightening as tears pricked her eyes. Kayla stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. She blinked twice, trying to focus on Julia. Daniel leaned close to her, speaking softly. "Sweetheart, there's someone here to say hello." Kayla nodded faintly, her movements sluggish. Julia forced a smile, though her chest ached at the sight of the exhaustion in Kayla's gaze. "Hi, Kayla. I'm Julia," she said gently. "I met your dad on a plane a few days ago." Kayla's voice was barely audible. "You're traveling a lot too?" Julia swallowed. "Yes, I came here for a conference, but I wanted to see you. Your dad says you're very brave." A flicker of a smile touched Kayla's lips. I try to be. I'm just so tired all the time." Her eyes darted toward the monitors. "But I'm going to get better." Emotion surged through Julia. This little girl, so fragile yet so resolute, stirred something profound within her. For the first time, she felt her carefully guarded prejudice unraveling, replaced by a raw, aching humanity she'd buried long ago. After Kayla dozed off again, Daniel turned to Julia, his voice subdued. "I appreciate you coming, but I'm still confused. What made you change your mind?" Julia flushed, shame tightening her throat. "I saw the news report about you and Kayla, and I remembered." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I remembered how awful I was on the plane. I realized my actions were hurtful and fueled by ignorance." Daniel's expression remained cautious. "You were harsh," he admitted, "but that was your choice to make." Still, it stung. To see someone dismiss me like that, as if I hadn't earned my place. As if I didn't belong. Julia's voice wavered. "I know," she said softly, tears threatening to spill. "I won't ask you to forgive me, not right away. But I donated to Kayla's fundraiser because, well, because I wanted to start making amends. I know money can't fix everything, but I had to do something." Daniel studied her for a long moment before nodding. "I do appreciate it. But Kayla's life isn't something you can fix with a check. I fight for her every day." Still, he exhaled, his tone softening. "I can see you're trying. That means something." Julia bowed her head, his words echoing in her mind. He was right. True change wouldn't come from one gesture. It would require more, something deeper. Over the next several days, Julia found herself drawn into Kayla's story more deeply than she ever anticipated. Between conference sessions, she returned to the hospital, bringing coloring books, children's stories, and small plush animals. She shared silly jokes and tales from her own childhood, earning shy smiles from Kayla as the girl slowly grew more comfortable with her presence. Julia also discovered that her initial donation had sparked a ripple effect. Her corporate acquaintances began contributing, pushing the fundraiser closer to its goal. But as the money flowed, Julia realized that Daniel needed more than just financial help. Navigating the labyrinth of insurance claims, medical paperwork, and second opinions was overwhelming, even for someone as resilient as Daniel. So, Julia volunteered to help. At first, Daniel hesitated. "You don't owe us your time," he said, fiddling with the wedding ring on the chain around his neck. "But if you really want to help, I won't say no." Julia threw herself into the task, channeling her corporate precision into solving Kayla's medical challenges. She identified a renowned surgeon with expertise in Kayla's condition, though the waitlist was excruciatingly long. Undeterred, Julia leveraged her network, making calls and pulling strings to expedite the process. One sunny afternoon, she stepped out of the hospital, her phone pressed to her ear. "I understand," she said to a contact, her tone firm. "But this is urgent. Please. Anything you can do to move her up the list?" Later, a colleague texted, "Missed your afternoon session. Everything okay?" Julia replied simply, "Helping someone who needs me." For the first time in years, she turned her back on the relentless pursuit of career advancement. Yet, for once, it felt right. That evening, as Julia prepared to leave the hospital, she crossed paths with Daniel in the hallway. He looked exhausted, but his weary smile carried a hint of gratitude. "Kayla had a rough afternoon," he said, "but she's stable again." He paused, studying her. "I see you running around, making calls, ignoring your corporate obligations. For us, why are you doing this?" Julia's heart pounded as she met his gaze. "Because I've realized you're worth it," she said softly. "And Kayla's worth it too. Not because you're a soldier or because I feel guilty, but because you're human beings who deserve help." Daniel's eyes softened, and for the first time, Julia thought she saw the faintest flicker of trust. Days blurred into a week, and finally, a breakthrough came. The specialized surgeon agreed to prioritize Kayla's case, partly due to mounting public interest, partly thanks to the hospital's philanthropic arm stepping in. Julia, now fully entrenched in the fight for Kayla, attended a hospital board meeting. She used her corporate acumen to advocate for immediate action. Whispers followed her, speculations that she was using power plays for personal gain. But for once, Julia didn't care. Her ambition wasn't about climbing the corporate ladder. It was about saving a life. The day of Kayla's surgery arrived in a whirlwind of anxiety and fragile hope. Julia stood beside Daniel in the brightly lit corridor of the pediatric surgical ward as nurses prepped Kayla. They exchanged only a few words, the gravity of the moment silencing them both. At the double doors leading to the operating room, Kayla clutched the small teddy bear Julia had given her. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she managed a brave smile. Her small voice trembled as she whispered, "I'll be okay, Daddy. Miss Julia says I'm strong." The words shattered Julia's composure. She turned away briefly, blinking back tears, before watching the doors close behind Kayla. Hours passed in the family lounge, each one dragging painfully. Daniel paced, his hands clasping and unclasping restlessly. Julia, seated near the wall clock, prayed silently. Though she'd never been religious, she found herself pleading with any power that might help Kayla. When the surgeon finally appeared, his fatigued expression was accompanied by a faint smile. "The procedure went well," he said. "We repaired the defect. While she'll need close monitoring, the prognosis is cautiously optimistic." A collective sigh of relief swept the room. Daniel buried his face in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Julia felt her own tears spill over. Without thinking, she reached out, resting a hand on his arm. Daniel looked up, gratitude filling his teary eyes, and pulled Julia into a brief but heartfelt embrace. The days that followed were a whirlwind of recovery. Pain management, follow-up scans, and the beginning of physical therapy dominated the schedule. Julia visited regularly, sometimes with fresh pajamas, healthy snacks, or a new bedtime story. Kayla, slowly regaining her energy, began to joke with her. "You're the coolest grown-up friend ever," she declared one evening. That simple statement warmed Julia's heart more than any corporate accolade ever had. Meanwhile, Kayla's story continued to gain traction. Local news outlets ran follow-ups, and even a few national segments highlighted the challenges military families face with medical insurance gaps. A short video interview featured Julia standing beside Daniel, describing the outpouring of donations and the journey to secure top-tier care for Kayla. Speculation swirled about a romantic angle between Julia and Daniel, but the truth was simpler and far more profound. A bond of respect and care had grown between them, one forged through shared struggle and a commitment to Kayla's well-being. Julia's transformation didn't end at the hospital door. She began confronting her own prejudices, seeking counseling to unpack biases she hadn't realized she held. Raised in a predominantly white, affluent neighborhood, she'd absorbed subtle but persistent racist sentiments from her surroundings. She now recognized how deeply those influences had shaped her worldview, including her initial treatment of Daniel. Though it was uncomfortable, she embraced the work of learning and unlearning, determined never to repeat the harm she'd inflicted. As Kayla's health stabilized, milestones brought moments of joy. A pediatric cardiologist eventually declared her ready for partial discharge. On the day Kayla left the hospital, she wore brand-new sneakers that lit up with every step. She wrapped Julia in a tight hug, her voice sincere and unguarded. "Thank you for helping me, Miss Julia," she said. "I hope you still come to see me, even though I'm not in the hospital." Julia's throat tightened. "I promise I will," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Daniel helped Kayla into a wheelchair for final procedures. Before they left, he turned to Julia, his voice quiet but steady. "I can't repay you for everything you've done. I know it started with a donation, but you went far beyond that. You've been here, fighting with us. I'll never forget it." Julia looked at him, her heart swelling. This was the man she'd once dismissed so cruelly. "Just let me stay in Kayla's life," she said softly. "That's all the repayment I need." The weeks that followed felt like stepping into the light after a long darkness. Kayla adjusted to her new medication regimen, rediscovering the joys of childhood. She began reading, drawing, and taking short walks in the park, Daniel gently pushing her lightweight stroller. Julia remained a constant presence, coordinating meal trains, bringing groceries, or simply stopping by to visit. For Julia, the corporate world that once defined her identity now felt different, less fulfilling. She continued her job, but with a new perspective, championing philanthropic initiatives. Management noticed her passion and offered her a role spearheading a new corporate social responsibility program. Julia accepted, realizing she could use her skills to help others like Kayla. One crisp autumn evening, 3 months after Kayla's surgery, Julia found herself at a barbecue at Daniel's aunt's house on the outskirts of Atlanta. The backyard was alive with laughter as Kayla giggled with cousins, pausing occasionally to catch her breath. Julia stood to the side, sipping cider, a sense of contentment washing over her. She had entered Kayla's life by chance, but staying had been her choice, a choice that had transformed her in ways she never thought possible. Daniel's extended family welcomed Julia with open arms. Though she was the only white person in attendance, for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like an outsider. Gratitude radiated from every smile and gesture, creating a warmth that soothed the lingering remnants of self-doubt. Seated at a picnic table, nibbling on potato salad, Julia watched as Daniel knelt beside Kayla, showing her how to toss a soft foam football. Kayla's first attempt sent the ball wobbling through the air, and she laughed so hard she had to hold her chest, mindful of the scar from her surgery. Daniel gently guided her arms for another throw, his voice calm and encouraging. This time, the ball sailed a few feet farther, and Kayla's triumphant giggles filled the yard. Julia closed her eyes for a moment, inhaling the mingling scents of charcoal smoke and freshly cut grass. She thought back to how it had all started. The hateful remarks she'd hurled on that flight, the assumptions she'd made about a black soldier in first class, and the harshness of her own voice echoing in her memory. If I hadn't taken that flight, if I hadn't read that news article, the thought was almost too immense to process. Fate, luck, or perhaps destiny had not only forced her to confront the ugliest parts of herself, but had also given her an unexpected chance to change. Later that evening, as the sky deepened to a dusky purple and fireflies danced in the cooling air, Kayla settled next to Julia. Her eyes gleamed with quiet excitement. "Can we read a story?" she asked, clutching Julia's arm lightly. "Of course," Julia replied, retrieving a slim hardcover book from her purse, a fairy tale collection she'd found at a local bookstore. Under the soft glow of the porch light, Julia began to read. Her voice wove tales of brave princesses and loyal knights, their adventures filling the night with magic. Kayla leaned her head against Julia's arm, listening intently, her tiny frame relaxed and content. Daniel stood nearby, his arms folded, his watchful gaze drifting between Kayla and Julia. Occasionally, he caught Julia's eye, his expression a mix of gratitude and quiet admiration. At one point, he mouthed a silent thank you. In that moment, Julia felt the final pieces of her old self fall away. The bond she shared with Daniel and Kayla was no longer rooted in guilt, but in something far deeper: empathy, love, and a shared journey through adversity. In the years that followed, Kayla's recovery continued, slow but steady. Each checkup brought more hopeful news, each milestone a celebration of her resilience. She returned to a semblance of normal childhood, embracing small joys like drawing, reading, and playing in the park. Julia's life, too, transformed. Her corporate role evolved into one aligned with her newfound purpose, championing philanthropic initiatives and advocating for systemic change. She became a vocal supporter of military families and children requiring specialized care, using her platform to challenge inequities she had once ignored. The guilt that had once gnawed at Julia softened over time, transforming into a quiet but persistent motivation to do better, not just for Daniel and Kayla, but for countless others who faced unseen struggles. She knew she could never undo the cruel words she'd spoken on that flight, but her actions spoke louder, creating a legacy of compassion and advocacy. Daniel, Kayla, and Julia became an unconventional family, bound not by blood but by gratitude and the choice to stand by one another through life's fiercest storms. What began as a seat assignment on an overbooked flight, an encounter marked by prejudice and contempt, became the prologue to a story of redemption, empathy, and shared humanity. It was proof that even our worst impulses can be overcome by simple truths: the power of honesty, the courage to change, and the boundless reach of compassion. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Let's keep the conversation going. What would you have done in Julia's shoes? Or Daniel's? Share your thoughts in the comments, We'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story of redemption and compassion touched your heart, hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Together, we can share more stories that inspire change and remind us of the power of empathy. This is more than just a channel, it's a community. Join us